Welcome to Lunchtime BABLing. My name is Shea Brown. I'm the CEO of BABL AI, a company that audits algorithms for bias, ethical risk, and effective governance. Today was kind of an exciting day. The new rules for New York City Local Law 144 were just adopted. So this will be as always, very informal discussion, but I'm going to go through those rules and take a look at them. Comment on them, and we'll see what we find. And so, as always, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. And they don't have to be about Local Law 144. That's just what's happening today. And so this is highly relevant for us and our clients. So let me just give a brief context for those who have not heard of Local Law 144. New York City Council passed this law last year, which requires people employers in particular, or employment agencies using automated employment decision tools. And the definition is part of what's going to be in these new rules, or is in these new rules. The people who are using that on New York residents. So it could, in theory, include having a global reach. Even if you're in a different country and you're recruiting out of New York, then this would be relevant for you. Any of those employers or employment agencies using these tools will need to have them audited for bias, and the new rules outline what that means. And you have to do that every year, and you have to have a summary of that audit results published on your website. And it has to be an independent auditor that does it. There are also other requirements, including notifications to an employee or candidates or employees. If it's used for promotion, then it could be current employees, and you have to notify them or at least have the notice available 10 days before. And so this has been an area of significant debate. In fact, our first webinar, a number of our webinars have been about this topic, because it is a really pioneering law, in the sense it's really the first time that these sort of, in the context of these kinds of AI tools, this is the first law that's really requiring explicit bias audits and this kind of disclosure, public disclosure of the results. And so it's a good test bed for what might happen in the future. And so let's dig into the new rules. So there was I think there were 3 different rounds of comments period and public testimony. BABL and myself, representing BABL, testified in all of those. And there was a lot of stakeholder engagement and a lot of feedback from industry, from civil society, and polling in kind of opposite directions in a lot of ways, where I think most of industry wanted a narrowing of the scope, and they wanted to get rid of requirements for independent auditors. They wanted to get rid of requirements for public disclosure and all of that stuff. And where civil society was sort of advocating for, and BABL, as well as on the auditor side, was advocating for more transparency and a broader scope, because we know that these tools can be potentially harmful if they are not tested and monitored and governed in appropriate ways. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up the rules, and I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to take a look at these rules together. So as always, if you have questions, please let me know. This is a really informal webinar about the topics of the day related to algorithmic auditing and AI governance and AI ethics. Okay, so these are the rules. So this is the notice of the adoption of the rules. So this is not proposed rules. These are the adopted rules. And the enforcement deadline has been pushed back to July 5th. And so let's take a look at some of the things that have changed since the new rules. So they have modified the definition of machine learning, statistical modeling, data analytics, and artificial intelligence to expand its scope. So this is one of the things that BABL really pushed back on. We thought that the scope of what they considered to be machine learning, statistical modeling, data analytics really limited it to be machine learning only, and that there are a number of statistical techniques or a number of other ways you can automate an employment process that could be discriminatory. I did a demonstration of it and put it up on YouTube, and we included that in our comments. And so I'm hoping that the new version is a little bit better. They've added a requirement that the bias audit indicate the number of individuals that the AED assessed that were not included in the calculations. And so they're basically wanting to include the full numbers in the summary. And this is actually something that I think is a good thing. And so they're asking for more transparency on the number of candidates or employees that were used in the testing data set and which ones weren't used. So they're also allowing the independent auditor to exclude a category that comprises less than 2% of the data being used for the bias audit. So if you have a really small percentage, a category that has really small numbers, you're allowed to exclude that from calculations of the impact ratio. So we'll see how that plays out. Clarifying when the employer or employee agency may rely on a bias audit conducted using historical data. And so we'll see what this means in a minute, but essentially the last proposed rules indicated that it is okay for an employer to use a bias audit that was done using data that include many employers, sort of aggregated, but they specified that you have to have contributed data to that. Some of your data has to be in there. And so presumably they have clarified this in these adopted rules. And then clarified that the number of applicants in a category and scoring rate of the category, if applicable, must be included in the summary of results. So this, in addition to including the numbers that weren't, means that they're trying to be more transparent. They want you to be more transparent. They don't want you have to be more transparent. Okay, so let's take a look, and I'm going to jump right to the worst issue. And when I say worst, I really mean worst. This is, in my view, a significant problem with this law. It's too late now in the sense that these rules are now adopted. We tried to push back against this in our comments. A lot of people pushed back against this in their comments, but it didn't seem to help. And so here it is, the definition of automated employment decision tool. So this is the thing that is most critical in terms of the scope. So what is if your tool is not counted as an automated employment decision tool, it does not need to comply with these rules. And so this is the gatekeeper, so to speak, to the scope of this, to whether you have to comply. And so it's really important that they get this right. And I feel like they got it wrong. Yeah, there's no other way, kind of nice way of saying that, but let's just read through it. An automated employment decision tool, or AEDT, means the tool that is defined in the code. So they defined the tool and someplace else in the original law, but they clarified the phrase to substantially assist or replace discretionary decision-making, okay? And that's the critical bit. What does that mean, to substantially assist or replace discretionary decision-making? And here they're outlining the three ways in which, three things that could mean. It means to rely solely on a simplified output. So simplified output is explained below, like a score, tag, classification, and ranking, with no other factors considered. So simplified output is one of, it's the thing that the tool does. And if that relies solely on that output, then this thing is an automated decision tool. Or to use a simplified output as one of a set of criteria. So maybe it's just one among many things that is considered. However, it is weighted more than any other criterion in the set. So it has to be the highest weighted criterion in the set. Presumably, what they mean here is also in an automated way. So it's almost like a formula that this is the most important factor and that some automated thing happens. And then here on the third one is where they clarify the what the human does or how the human plays into this, how the recruiter or the employer plays into this. Or to use a simplified output to override conclusions derived from other factors. So this is overrule, conclusions derived from other factors, including human decision-making. And so what this means is it has to fulfill one of these three things. So it has to be either fully automated, basically, where it is the only factor, or it is the most important factor, or if humans are involved, human decision-making is involved, this simplified output has to overrule all other factors, including human decision-making. And so I think this is a severe limitation in the scope of this law, because what we will see is you can make an argument. I mean, there are very few tools that would fall under this. You know, if you have a something that predicts personality traits, and that personality trait is displayed to a recruiter or to an employer, as long as that is just one of many considerations, that is not counted. Doesn't matter. So essentially, if that could be highly biased, but it doesn't matter as long as the human is there to make the ultimate decision. Ranking. So I think the biggest one here, the biggest worry is that some of these, many of these tools are used for ranking according to some trait. You get some score, you get some goodness of fit or something like this, and you have a ranked list, and the recruiter can look through that ranked list from sorted according to highest to lowest. And I think the worry here for me and BABL and a lot of people that I talk to in civil society, the worry is that in practice, according to this rule, if the human is still making that decision and they're just looking at this ranked list, it doesn't count. Even though that ranked list could have 10,000 candidates in it, in theory. You could have a huge list of candidates, and in theory, you could scroll down and look at all of them, or you can go through pages and look at all of them. Or if they're available to be seen, it would not fall under, and this is not legal advice, by the way. I want to point out that I'm not providing legal advice here. This is just my opinion based on what I'm seeing. But you could argue that that is not an AEDT, even though that is sort of the quintessential, what I think most people consider is a quintessential use case for an AEDT. Now, in the rules further on, they'll talk about CV screening, where you rank and then you literally exclude a part of that list. That, of course, does fall under this. So if you don't show all of the options and you do some automatic filtering based on some cutoff, then that would be in scope. But I think that, yeah, I think we'll see people making workarounds and simply just make the whole list available by default to avoid that falling in scope here. And so I think this was a misstep, in my personal opinion. But anyway, I'm not in charge, so these are the rules now. Okay, so that was that. That's my rant on that particular thing. I think this severely limits what actually needs to comply with all these. So in some sense, many of this other stuff is less important now because there are fewer tools that even need to undergo this process. Okay, so most of the bias audit candidates for employment, a lot of these are very straightforward, and sort of adhere to what I would consider as sort of reasonable. Historical data, it's important. They clarify what that means. It's data collected during an employer or employment agency's use of an AEDT. So this will be important later to assess a candidate for employment or employees for promotion. So this is the data that's collected for a given employer or employment agency. This is the data they've collected, or that the platform or the tool collects about the use of this tool. So it's literally historical data of them using the tool. Independent auditor, this stayed pretty much the same from previously, and I like this definition of independent auditor. I'm biased, of course, because the whole thing with BABL is that we are independent auditors. We don't take money if we're auditing somebody, we don't take any money from them other than audit fees. We follow strict independence in that way. That's one of our selling points, and so it's important that for us that's in here, that's recognized as an important thing. And so it just clarifies that it can't be somebody working either for the tool, the company that makes the tool, or the employer, and you don't have you weren't involved in developing or distributing it. You weren't employed there. And importantly, at any point during the bias audit has a direct financial interest or material indirect financial interest in an employer or an employment agency that seeks to use or continue to use the AEDT. So that means I couldn't be a consultant for a company and they're paying me to help them do whatever. And then I audit them independently. That's not going to work. And I think that's a great addition. Again, because the scope is limited, I think that's less relevant because there are fewer tools that are actually going to need to be audited. Okay, they define impact ratio. This was the same as the last rules. I won't go over it, but it's basically the selection rate for a particular category divided by the selection rate for the most selected, or the highest selection rate category, or the preferred or advantaged group. That's standard. This is non-standard. This is new to this law, which is something called the scoring rate. The scoring rate is basically if it gives a score, if the tool gives a score, you essentially take the median of that from the testing data set or the historical data. You take the median score, and scoring rate is basically for a category is essentially what fraction is gets a score that's above that median score. And so this is impact ratio is kind of a new kind of impact ratio, which is the ratio of these scoring rates. Okay, so here we're at another scope, either narrowing or expanding definition, which is machine learning, statistical modeling, data analytics, or artificial intelligence. This was part of the definition, the original definition of AEDT. So the thing we just looked at previously, the very first thing was the bit about how does it affect discretionary decision making? That's the one that really limits the scope. So let's see what this one looks like. They say that it means a group of mathematical computer-based techniques. So it's going to be on a computer that one generates a prediction, meaning an expected outcome for an observation, such as an assessment of a candidate's fit or likelihood of success, or that generate a classification, meaning an assignment of an observation to a group, such as categorizations based on skill sets, aptitudes. Okay, so this is it's got to be a computer that basically makes some inference about a person. So it's inferring something, or inference could be a prediction or it could be a classification, but it's making some inference about a person. And so this is an and here, so it has to be that and for which computer at least in part identifies the inputs, the relative importance placed on those inputs, and if applicable, other parameters for the models in order to improve the accuracy of their prediction or classification. So let me think about this for a second. So I'm trying to identify whether this is better or worse than the last one. So I feel like they had removed one of the categories. There was 3 and now there's 2, but I feel like this is also pointing pretty directly towards machine learning. They took out a little bit of the machine learning language, so it's not exactly, it's not as strictly machine learning as before. And so computer, at least in part, identifies the inputs, the relative importance. So that's unlikely that the computer will identify the inputs. That's almost always selected by the engineer. But so that part I think is not going to be relevant for most tools. The relative importance placed on those inputs. This could be machine learning or it could not be. So this could be if I do some statistical technique to identify which of the inputs, like this could be curve fitting, for instance, where I'm essentially deriving weights for inputs in order to make classifications more accurate. And so this could include statistical modeling. And then there's an if applicable, other parameters for the models in order to improve the accuracy of the prediction or classification. So I'm not sure how to read if applicable. So what if it's not applicable? So if I have a curve fitting, so plain old statistical modeling, which in some sense it is machine learning, to identify weights from inputs, I've identified those weights, and the machine will identify the relative importance, then that would be in scope. So my gut reaction first read this is better than the previous one. I still think there might be some people could argue over things here, whether all three, there's the and there, but then there's also the if applicable. And so the example I gave that was out of scope previously, you can look at our YouTube channel. There was one where I talked about even simple algorithms can discriminate. That was the title of the video. And if we're in YouTube, I can put a link to that video above. I was talking about the K nearest neighbors method, where essentially there's no learning. You just essentially try to find how close a candidate is to, let's say, a given data, other candidates with labeled properties in a given data set. And in that case, would that fall under this new decision making? For the first section, it would. So to generate a prediction or expected outcome, that it's making an inference. And for number two, the computer, at least in part, identifies the inputs. That's not the case for this, but so that wouldn't count. But then the relative importance placed on those inputs, if applicable, in some sense, that might be in scope. I don't want to ramble too much on here. I have to analyze this a little bit more, but I think this is an improvement, although marginal improvement on what came before. And so I might have to dig a little deeper. But my gut reaction or my hot take on this is that it's an improvement. It is a broadening of the scope. And I have to think a little harder about it to figure out exactly how significant a broadening it is. Again, we still have the exact same problem that there is a narrowing of the scope up above, which can supersede this. Okay, so this is where they define the scoring rate. We won't talk about that. Selection rate, I think most people know what that is, or at least you can look it up. Simplified output, and this covers a whole lot of things, and pretty much anything that sounds reasonable would be counted under simplified output. Things like just classification of, or scoring, giving you a score, or assessing your skills and ranking you, or putting you into a particular group based on personality or based on anything like that. Okay. Here's the section for the bias audit. So the important bit is the bias audit has to be done every year. And I think a lot of what's being said here is sort of clarifying that. You also need to calculate, and this is something that stuck from the last rules, which I like. You have to calculate the selection rate for each category and calculate the impact ratio for each category. Those you'll see later will also have to get disclosed. And you also have to ensure that you do it both on a non-intersectional basis, so for sex categories separately and race, ethnicity categories separately. And then you also have to do it for intersectional categories. And so that's something that stuck. That's a very, that's not standard, but that's a very kind of progressive way. So that was a really progressive take by the department in this sense. And there was some pushback on that, but I think that's okay. This is a new landscape we're looking at, we're gonna. So I think that was a push forward and something that's interesting to look at, because we know that intersectional, certain people in certain intersectional categories can be higher risk. I think that the gender shades study that talked about face detection algorithms being significantly worse performing for women of color. I think that sort of highlights the need to look intersectionally. And so it's debatable. I mean, you can be on either side. I think this is a good thing. So we have to ensure the calculations are performed for each group for promotion 2. And then here you have to indicate the number of individuals the AEDT assessed that are not included in the required calculations because they fall into some unknown category. And so this is just specifying if someone was in an unknown category, then you need to say there was some number of candidates that we didn't know what their race or ethnicity or gender was, and so we couldn't put them into a category. And so here's an example, and I've been through these examples before. They look pretty much the same, but there's a few things that are interestingly different. An employer wants to use an AEDT to screen resumes and schedule interviews for a job posting. To do so, the employer must ensure that a bias audit of the AEDT was conducted no more than a year before the planned use of the AEDT. So this is just reiterating the fact that you got to do it within a year. This bias audit is necessary. So this is interesting. The bias audit is necessary even though the employer is not using the AEDT to make the final hiring decision, but only to screen out at an early point in the application process. So here they are emphasizing the fact that it doesn't have to be, even if you have a human at some point in the process, if there is some automatic filtering anywhere in that funnel, then that will count as an AEDT. So I'm glad they did that. However, it doesn't really help the narrowing that I was talking about above, because if that CV screener outputs the entire list of people just ranked, and the human looks at that list and presumably selects the top subset, but has access to that entire list, I think that people could argue that that's not an AEDT, and given the current rules. And so I think this helps that they clarify that if that happens anywhere in the funnel, that you do have to still do the audit. But I think the weakness of the earlier narrowing still applies. Okay, the employer asks the vendor for a bias audit. This is something that was new from before, and they still allow for vendors to commission the bias audit to be done. And the vendor provides historical data regarding the applicant selection that vendor has collected from multiple employers to an independent auditor who will conduct a bias audit as follows. And so this is saying a vendor can do it for many employers by using many employers' data, and they're going to give it to an independent auditor. And here you can see that you have the non-intersectional results, number of applicants, number selected, selection rate, impact ratio. Everything is going to be here for the non-intersectional results, and then you have to do intersectional results here. And let me make sure that the calculations, yes, look good. And so, yes, and then they also have to note the AEDT was also used to assess 250 individuals with unknown sex or race ethnicity category. Data on those individuals is not included in the calculations above. That all looks good. Everything looks the same as before, except for this new announcement here, where you have to talk about how many people fell outside that category. Now we have another example where you scores a candidate for employment or employees being considered for a promotion. So this is now when there's a score being assigned. Calculate the median score of the full sample of applicants. Calculate the scoring rate for the individuals in each category. Calculate the impact ratio. And so this is just saying everything that for selection rate that counted above, this is true for the scoring rate when you have an average score. Well, when you have a scoring rate, which is calculated from the median score. So if you're above, what fraction is above the median score? And you have to do intersectionally. And you also have to indicate how many fell outside of the sort of known categories. You can exclude that represent 2% of the data being used from the required calculations. Where such a category is excluded, the summary of results must include, so this is something that's new that auditors need to pay attention to, The summary of results must include the independent auditor's justification for the exclusion. And so the auditor's got to put a justification for that exclusion, as well as number of applicants and scoring rate or selection rate for excluded category. So this is where I'm a little bit confused, because you can exclude a small category, a small number category, but you then have to talk about the number of applicants and the scoring rate and selection rate. So you have to include all the same information. So I'm not sure how that plays out, but I'll have to think about that a little bit more. So here they give us an example. Maybe this will clarify. An employer uses a AEDT to score an applicant for a culture fit. So this was an example that had been used before. To do so, the employer must ensure that a bias audit was conducted, within a year. The employer provides historical data on the culture fit score to applicants for each category to an independent auditor to conduct the bias audit. So here you have, the difference here is they have the number of applicants are required. That was not there before, and here they're saying you got to have the number of applicants, the scoring rate, and then the impact ratio. And it's for both intersectional and not intersectional. And then they have for the intersectional. And so no, the AEDT was assessed 15 individuals with unknown sex or race ethnicity categories. Data on these individuals not included in the calculations above. What it doesn't show us is the case of the less than 2%. So this is where there's a little bit of uncertainty. If I had a category that was less than 2%, so let me read this again. May exclude a category that represents less than 2% of the data being used for the bias audit. So let's say, like some categories that are often very small, might be Native American or Alaskan Native, for instance, or potentially Native Hawaiian. Those could be small. And so let's say that was excluded. They still say that you need a justification for why it was excluded, as well as the number of applicants and scoring rate and or selection rate of the excluded category. So in my mind, they're basically saying you don't have to include the impact ratio, but you do include the scoring rate or the selection rate. And so you wouldn't include it in the table. You would down below say we had this many number of Native American or Alaskan Native applicants, and that they got this scoring rate or that they got this selection rate, and you wouldn't calculate impact ratio. So, okay, that's interesting. So they don't give an example of that here. They just talk about the non-categorized ones. Okay, so that's new. Take note of that. Data requirements. So here they are clarifying the historical data used to conduct a bias audit may be from one or more employers or employment agencies that use the AEDT. However, an individual employer or employment agency may rely on a bias audit that uses historical data of other employers only in the following circumstances. If the employer or employment agency provides historical data from its own use of the AEDT to the independent auditor. So you have to have contributed data. Or if such an employer or employment agency has never used the AEDT. Okay, so if you've never used it, you don't have to do it. Or if you've supplied your data, so you have to have supplied historical data for the audit, and you have not used the AEDT. Test data, notwithstanding the requirements of subdivision A of this section, an employer or employment agency may rely on a bias audit that uses test data if insufficient historical data is available to conduct a statistically significant bias audit. This statistically significant bit leaves a lot up to interpretation, but whatever. If a bias audit uses test data, the summary of results of the audit must explain why historical data was not used and describe how the test data was was generated and obtained. Okay, so you just have to be real explicit about that. So here's some examples. They did not give examples before, so this is all brand new. Example 1, an employer is planning to use an AEDT for the first time. The employer may rely on a bias audit conducted using historical data or other employers or employment agencies, or on a bias audit conducted using test data. So if you're using it for the first time, you're allowed to use the audit presumably from the vendor that uses other data. Example 2. An employment agency has been using an AEDT for 6 months. Okay, they're getting real specific now. The bias audit the employment agency relied on before its first use of the AEDT was conducted 10 months ago using test data. Okay, so they started using the tool. They've been using it for 6 months. They have been relying on an old bias audit that doesn't include any of their data. The employment agency will need an updated bias audit if it will continue to use AEDT once the 12 months have passed, since the bias audit first relied on was conducted. The employment agency's data from 6 months of use of the AEDT is not sufficient on its own to conduct a statistically significant bias audit. So what this is saying is the 6 months of the data that they've used, they can't conduct their own bias audit with that 6 months. The employment agency may rely on a bias audit using the historical data of other employers and employment agencies if it provides its 6 months of historical data to the independent auditor for use and consideration. The employment agency may also rely on a bias audit that uses test data. Okay, so this explicitly says even if you've been using it and you don't have a statistically significant sample, you can use historical data from other employers and/or test data. Example 3. An employer has been using AEDT for 3 years and will soon need an updated bias audit. The employer has statistically significant data from its 3 years of use of the AEDT. The employer may rely on a bias audit conducted using historical data from multiple employers if it provides its 3 years of historical data to the independent auditor for use and consideration. So here it sounds like they need to give it all of the data that it's been using if they want to use that audit. The employer may also rely on a bias audit conducted using historical data from its own use of the AEDT without any data from other employers. Okay, so it's saying it's very clearly that it's an option just to use your own in this case if you have enough data. The employer may not rely on a bias audit conducted using test data. So this is interesting, an interesting development, because what that means is there could be a situation where you have for example 3, you have an employer that's been using a particular tool for 3 years. And let's say they don't give their demographic information to their vendor. So their vendor does not have access to their historical data. Now, in theory, it's allowed that, if the vendor is going to conduct the audit, they might have to use test data in this case. What this is saying is that the employer can't rely on a vendor's audit using test data if they have enough data of their own to use historical data. So this is a hot take. This is me just reading this now. I highlighted it because it sounded important before, but I haven't really thought through it. But this is an interesting case because there are a number of cases where employers do not give demographic data to their vendors for obvious reasons because of data privacy and security. But they may still ask the vendor for a bias audit. And that puts the vendor in a pretty tough situation. They don't have demographic information. So let's say the vendor does their best to use testing data, other kinds of data to assess this situation. In this case, what this is saying is that employer can't use that audit. There's no excuse. If they have enough data, historical data from the use of that tool, they have to use historical data. They can't use some other alternative method. So I guess this puts employers on notice that if either they have to share their data with their vendors in order to get the testing done, or they got to do the testing themselves using their historical data. They can't use quote unquote test data, which is other kinds of data that's not from the use of that tool. All right, so that's new and that's interesting, and that's a new development. So just note that. Okay, and then there's a bit here which is less interesting for us because we are biased. We're auditors. We do audits, but well, actually, no. This is still relevant. The published results. What has to be published? Okay. So before the use of the tool, the agency must make the following. The employer has to make the following publicly available on the employment section of their website. So the employer themselves, pick any large employer that's doing this. They have to put it on their section of their website in clear and concise manner, the date of the most recent bias audit of the AEDT, and a summary of the results. So the summary results are basically going to look like this. Okay, so that's the minimum, is that they have to actually have these numbers there, which will include the source and explanation of the data used. So it can't just be that, it has to also have this source and explanation of the data to conduct the bias audit, the number of individuals assessed that fall within an unknown category, and the number of applicants or candidates, the selection or scoring rates as applicable, and the impact ratios for all categories. So you got to have that table basically, and you have to describe the data, and you need to also have the distribution date of the AEDT here, which is basically the date in which the employer started using it. The requirements of subdivision A of this section must be met with an active may be met. So you can have an active hyperlink to a website containing the required summary of results and distribution date. So you can, instead of putting all of that on the employment section of your website, you might just have a link that goes to another website that has all that information, as long as it's clearly marked as a link to the results of the bias audit. It can't be just like find out more here. It has to be look at the summary of our bias audit results, or something of that nature. And you have to keep the summary results and distribution date posted for at least 6 months after its latest use. So if you stop using it, you got to keep it up there for 6 months, essentially, is what that means. Okay, and then there's a notice to candidates. You have to allow candidates to know, candidates have to know that this tool is being used. There are 3 ways of doing that. Provide notice to the employment section of a website in clear and conspicuous manner at least 10 business days before the use of the tool. So you got to have it up there before the use of the tool. Provide notice in a job posting at least 10 business days before the use of the tool, or provide notice to candidates or employment via U.S. mail or email at least 10 business days before the use of the AEDT. Most people, of course, are going to sort of pick 1 and 2, I'm guessing, where they're just going to put the notice up whenever they have a job posting, and they're going to have to wait 10 days before they use the tool if they post for a job. But that's sort of less onerous, I think, than what it previously was before. Okay, and then it just talks about, it just reiterates this again for allowing for opt-out, basically here. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. So this was an overview of the new rules. So to give a summary, the rules have been adopted. So they're done, they're over with, they've been adopted, and the enforcement deadline is now July 5th. And so BABL is going to be doing a more detailed look at this, and so for our clients, we'll be giving them a notification if there have to be any changes to our audits. If you are a company that falls within the scope of this law and you need to be audited, there's now a little extra time, although not much, to contact us and ask for an audit, or to get advice if you just want some guidance. And yeah, so I'm a little bit disappointed that the scope of the law, I'm more than a little bit disappointed. I'm quite disappointed that the scope of the law has remained so narrow that I feel like there's very few tools that are actually going to fall in the scope of this law. And so a lot of the teeth have been taken out of it. But this is clearly, this is the first of many laws that are being proposed. And so we just have to push forward and hope that other laws that are now being proposed, for instance, in California, New Jersey, and other places, are going to learn lessons from this, and hopefully be careful to include a lot of the classic tools, that augmented decision tools, that are clearly problematic if they're biased, even if they don't overrule human decision making. In the end, between automation bias and selection bias, those two combined make it really important that all of these tools get tested or governed in some way. All right, if you're listening to this on a podcast, thank you for listening. If you're on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Thank you so much for showing up to Lunchtime BABLing, and I'll see you all next week.